Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Steve Orlins. I'm president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the third in our Leaders Speak series, celebrating the National Committee's 50th anniversary. For 50 years, we have been educating Americans about China and Chinese about America. From ping-pong diplomacy to today, we have sought to strengthen the bilateral relationship by fostering exchanges and informed discussions. This year, we have already gathered former Secretaries of Defense and Secretaries of Commerce and United States trade representatives, including our own chair, Carla Hills, who's with us today. Later this year, we will gather U.S. Treasury secretaries, business leaders who have blazed paths in doing business with China, and on December 5th, Secretaries of State led by Henry Kissinger and Madeleine Albright. And finally, next year, we will hold a similar program with Chinese officials, many of whom are alumni of our program. Today, I'm joined by three former national security advisors. All three have served our country above and beyond the call of duty and have contributed to peace in this world in ways too numerous to enumerate. If I began to list all their accomplishments, I would have no time for discussions. So let me go right to questions. I will start with Richard Allen, who served as National Security Advisor during the early years of the Reagan administration. Go to Bud McFarlane, who served from 1983 to 1985, somewhat later in the Reagan administration. And then go to Steve Hadley, who served during the final 4 years of the George W. Bush administration. I and the American people cannot thank all of you enough for your service to our country, and I'm thrilled to be with you today. Mr. Allen, at the beginning of the Reagan administration, China looked nothing like it does today, and the Soviet Union was still the threat that united us and the Chinese. Tell us about the U.S.-China strategic relationship when you were National Security Advisor, the August 1982 communique, and how you dealt with the Chinese, and then close with kind of some comments on the lessons that you learned from that period about dealing with China going forward today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be with my esteemed associates here. I'm so pleased to see that so many people are able to get out of work on a summer afternoon and be here this early in order to have had a refreshment already and then sit down and listen to three former national security advisors discuss interesting problems and opportunities. At the time that Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980, there was a widespread misimpression that he intended to scrap the newly established relationship with China, opened by Jimmy Carter, formally, and that this would entail a series of clashes, not only of opinion, but perhaps in more substantive ways. There was a widespread editorial comment accrediting Reagan with positions that were not his. And so in the interim between the Republican convention and the Democrat convention, George Bush, having been the newly minted vice presidential candidate serving on the ticket with Ronald Reagan, I asked Mr. Reagan to allow me to take and go with George Bush to China to explain the details of the position. He was taking heavy flack also from China. And we were able to complete that trip. We met with then Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping in the Great Hall of the People with a wide array of other officials. We were housed in the Daoyutai guest houses, and one thought that perhaps the relationship would be able to get off to a very smooth start. Anyone who has dealt with China, either in business or in terms of policy, knows that negotiations play a very important part in the bilateral relationship. And we had, of course, the lingering, some would say, thorn of our relations with Taiwan. In 1979, also, the Taiwan Relations Act had been passed, to the great upset of Beijing. But Congress was determined that it would rewrite what President Carter initially sent down to the Congress for negotiation and discussion, and sent back a substantially, if not completely different draft from what had gone down from the White House. That also caused some room for serious discussion and elaboration. My experience was always quite positive with the Chinese side. I saw no insuperable obstacles, and it was a matter of getting to know one another in a more, one might say, brotherly way, in a more amenable way, so that we would be able to conduct a normal course of diplomatic relations with China. I experienced no problem during my tenure as National Security Advisor, and I found that the possibility of elaboration of the cooperation that was established by President Carter could be pushed forward without jeopardizing any other interests that the United States and the Congress had. Because without the Congress, as one soon-to-be Republican nominee, perhaps, will find out, without the Congress, not very much can be done. And without keeping the Congress informed, up to speed, and knowledgeable about current conditions, there's not going to be any successful policy. So therefore, we proceeded on a very cautious pace. It was an exceptionally interesting time, and it was rocky at first because there was great mistrust of President Reagan and those who were accompanying him to office. But Alexander Haig became Secretary of State, and that was a vastly reassuring sign, so to speak, for the Chinese side. He, having been military assistant to Henry Kissinger, when Henry undertook the secret travel to China in order to establish a relationship and lead to something quite positive that exists today between our two nations. I think on the whole, I had no complaints whatever. Chinese were sometimes displeased about certain actions that the president took, but on the whole, things were smooth. One couldn't have envisaged the kind of economic cooperation and intercourse that we have today. It's simply impossible. President Nixon, though, did have such a vision, even as far back as 1967, as he was penning his famous, now famous article, the one that was completely ignored by the press, by academia, and by everyone else, in the October 1967 issue of Foreign Affairs entitled Asia After Vietnam. In that article, he had signaled what he was going to do, but it was oblique, and the hint that there would be more than one summit conference ending the hostilities in Vietnam was not taken or was not observed. My experience in my lifetime has been one of a positive nature. We have still been able to maintain our relationship with Taiwan, although China doesn't like that, but it's a fact of life, and it has strongest support in the Congress. In fact, the Taiwan Relations Act was recently reaffirmed by the Congress just this past spring. So all in all, there is no need, I think, for great concern. The economic cooperation is expanding at a rapid pace, and I wouldn't expect it to be any different in the years immediately ahead.
Mr. McFarland,
Sir, well done.
you were National Security Advisor a little later. President Reagan, I guess, went to China when you were National Security Advisor, which I guess was the second visit ever by any American president to China. What were kind of the issues on your plate during that era? And are there lessons to be learned from those issues that can be applied today?
Steve, the early 80s were a time, from China's perspective, of internal focus for Deng Xiaoping to manage this terribly complex transition from a society of the limit of central planning and coming out gradually from the Cultural Revolution. This visionary Chinese saw the importance of leading the country in a more open direction. A man of astonishing capacity, he understood that if you're going to move away from what had been the orthodoxy of Marxist planning and so forth, first you'd better be able to put food on the table. And by liberalizing agriculture, he was able to stimulate phenomenal results in China being able to feed itself easily. And he went on from there to recognize that as he led this historic transformation, it was important that there be no external stresses, or as few as possible. And so, in the continuation of what Dick has described so well, we faced no crises at all in the early 80s. There was a periodic blip, as Dick has described, regarding our arms sales to Taiwan. And yet, China's sense of purpose in guiding the country toward stability first, but growth, opening the country to investment that has proven, again, historic in its result, enabled China in the next 30 years to have what is a well-known record of unprecedented growth, development, and evolution. What has been uncertain in recent years has been, can China then, having achieved this remarkable pinnacle as a giant economic force, began to play a role as a great power in the resolution of global issues? One can imagine from nuclear proliferation to climate change to energy issues that are very much on the Chinese agenda. And in the past 10 years, with a bipartisan panel that includes many American sinologists, we've tried to focus on relieving some of those issues with China. China, for its own part, began in the 90s to focus intensively on energy and began to do so with essentially a mercantilist outreach to East Africa, Central Asia, to try to literally buy and begin to assure control of energy assets, oil, gas, with mixed results. Today, however, President Xi Jinping has begun to, if not question that approach, at least to begin to be more open to a more traditional commercial relationship with sources of energy. And yet there is one remaining very sharp challenge that he faces, and that is that he and the leaders of Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and all of East Asia are relying upon oil and gas from the same source, the Persian Gulf, and consequently is viewing how it can assure that those sea lines of communications are maintained open and that China can have confidence of access to what has become a more than strategic commodity now that China is producing more automobiles or hosting the production of more than the United States. Together, we produce almost half of the automobiles in the world, but you've got to power those automobiles with something. And China has only coal and therefore is still very conscious of the vulnerability of their transportation sector. And so together with the United States, which has had the good fortune with the shale revolution to establish energy security of an unparalleled level, here is an agenda item that certainly warrants our cooperation in the years ahead. But beyond just bilateral vulnerabilities, I come back to the issue of whether or not China has reached a stage where it is ready, willing, and able to play a larger role in the resolution of transnational issues. I have one example which is nascent in the sense not much is said about it, but it flows from the agreement last year which Iran and the United States, along with the P5+1, concluded an agreement on nuclear policy. And without dissecting the terms of that agreement, one of its results has been to stimulate a passionate interest among the Gulf Arab states in achieving the equivalent capability for power generation, and who knows what more. In short, the potential for a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. Well, Russia has rushed in to try to provide the power generation capability and has the design and infrastructure to do it, if not the finance, but without the restraints that you and I and anyone would want to see to assure against diversion of enriched uranium, the ability to reprocess it. And so together, the United States and China have begun to discuss very concretely, is China ready to step up to this challenge? China has a nuclear industry that is quite robust and interested in growing. They would like to have better relationships with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arab sources of petroleum. And the response has been quite encouraging. On our side, where our nuclear industry has declined substantially in the last 20 years, cooperation with China, where we could bring to bear substantial expertise from people with long histories in nuclear power in America, a team that could propose and is proposing to the Gulf Arab states will provide nuclear power and electricity. However, the entire fuel cycle, from fuel fabrication to transmission to the actual operations of each plant that is built, and the ultimate recovery of all spent fuel and disposal of it, is being warmly received by the Arab states and China. But picture that. Two great powers cooperating and avoiding a nuclear arms race and the most strategically important locus of energy in the world, and a place in question regarding whether we can together find a way to overcome the subsidiary risks posed by Islam, extremism. This is an agenda which China has taken an interest in.
Good. Well, this just sounds like an example of what Bob Zellick talked about at our dinner 11 years ago, China being a responsible stakeholder. I think you've raised an issue where China can actually be, fall exactly within that framework. But let me move on to Steve, who is, I guess, the only one of this panel who served in the post-June 4th, 1989 world, where also the Soviet Union ceased to be the threat, the strategic threat that united us. So what was our relationship like during your period as National Security Advisor, and what lessons should we take home from that?
Well, I'll talk about the whole 8 years, because I was deputy the first 4, National Security Advisor the second. We got off to a rather rough start in China. Began in the campaign when then governor and candidate George W. Bush said he thought China was less a strategic partner and more a strategic competitor. And that kind of got the Chinese attention. And then he got elected president, and he went and had a press conference, and I was supporting him at the time, and he was asked, would the United States militarily come to the defense of Taiwan? The president said, sure. And everybody, reacted, and he came out afterwards, he said, did I just do something? I said, well, Mr. President, you just stripped away about 2 decades of ambiguity on the very point that you affirmed. And then, of course, we had the EP-3 incident, where a Chinese hot-dogging pilot collided with a U.S. EP-3 and almost was a disaster and was an enormous crisis management challenge for us. So we got off to a rather rough start. I think it sent a signal of toughness for the new president, which probably was a good platform to get started. So what was the approach the president took? Well, one was, I think his assessment was that Asia, without the kind of security institutions we have in Europe, its stability was maintained by the fact that the United States tended to have better relations with all the countries of Asia than any of them had with each other. And so his view was we need to strengthen our relationship with Japan, with South Korea, and with China all at the same time. And largely he did. I think we had a good relationship with China. We resolved a lot of bilateral issues with Japan and South Korea. Dennis Wild is here. He was a big part of all that. So that was one thing he did. Secondly, he had a view that, as I think a lot of people had, the way you deal with a country like China is you cooperate where you can, and you be clear where you disagree, where we stand, but try to do a lot of that second part as much in private as you can, rather than be confrontational in public. Third, we had the problem of Taiwan and Chen Shui-bian and the risk that Taiwan would go for independence. And there, the president finally learned how to say, 3 communiques, Taiwan Relations Act and Shanghai Communique and all that stuff. But he also said that he did not support Taiwanese independence, and there should be no unilateral change in the circumstances by either party. And that allowed us to manage through a very difficult time in U.S.-China relations posed by the problem of Taiwan. So it was going pretty well, and he also had another way of dealing with the Chinese leader, and I remember with Hu Jintao, and I'll stop after this, but his view was, you got to be very candid about things we're going to be able to do together and things where we're going to disagree. So he met with Hu Jintao at one meeting, and he said, I have good news and bad news. Which would you like first? Hu Jintao said, well, I'd like the good news. And he said, so this was at the time of the Beijing Olympics, where a lot of countries were about to boycott, and everyone was wondering what was the president doing. He said to Hu Jintao, he said, I'm coming to the Beijing Olympics. I'm coming with my father, his family, and all of my family. I'm coming for the opening ceremonies, and I'm staying the whole time, which really put the revolt about not going to the Beijing Olympics to bed. And Hu Jintao said, gee, that's wonderful. Mr. President got up. And the President, wait a minute. I have to tell you the bad news. And Hu Jintao said, well, all right, if you must. He said, I'm going to participate in a ceremony at the halls of Congress to give the Dalai Lama the Congressional Gold Medal. And Hu Jintao said, well, Mr. President, the great Chinese people, they're not going to understand. He said, I know they're not going to understand, but I have to do it, and I told you up front, I'm telling you up front, I'm coming to the Olympics, but I'm giving the Dalai Lama the medal. And that was his view. That's the way you did it. You were upfront, you were clear what you could do, what you had to do, what you couldn't do. And that communication, I think, was good. And I think that's not a bad model for how to deal with the Chinese going forward.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my first substantive question, which is the South China Seas. It's become, probably unexpectedly for all of us, the major area of contention between the United States and China. The Chinese believe we are exaggerating its importance. They believe our concern about commercial navigation is wrong because China, as Bud was pointing out, is wholly dependent on those energy routes for its commercial, those sea lanes for its energy and trade. So what should the next, or this administration, since we're likely to see a judgment from the Philippine arbitral, from the UNCLOS arbitral tribunal on the Philippines case in the next several weeks, what should we be doing? And I guess the subsidiary question is, should the U.S. Senate ratify UNCLOS? That's the easy one. Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I can say that in an interesting parallel, within 6 months of the advent of the Reagan administration in 1981, I was asked by the Secretary of the Navy, John Lehman, about a particular problem that had been developing in the Gulf of Sidra, Libya. And if you just imagine the stretch of the Gulf of Sidra and the Libyan claim that its territorial waters went straight across. But you can also imagine that didn't go down very well with the United States Navy. And we decided to do an exercise and sail into the waters, the disputed waters of the Gulf of Sidra. And at that particular point, there were budget discussions taking place in California because the president was partly on vacation and back and forth. I posted 2 staff, my deputy and another staffer, in the Situation Room to sleep there all night long to see what would happen when the balloon would go up. And sure enough, the balloon went up. And I got a call about, I suppose, 1 a.m. California time saying, well, we went in there, they sent out a couple of MiGs, and Dick, I can tell you, a couple of MiGs are down in the ocean out there. And I said, really? Well, I said, just keep me posted. I'll get right back to you. And I called the president, and the White House operator put me through instead to Ed Meese. And said, what do you want to call the president for? And I said, pardon me, something's just happened, and this is what's just happened. And he said, well, he went to sleep. And I said, yes. So wake him up. Oh, he said, I don't think we better do that right now. I said, you'll be sorry. These were the early days of CNN. CNN was just getting started. There was a little hole in the wall on Wisconsin Avenue, some of you may remember. Sure enough, the reports began churning. I get another call. Here's another news report. There's an AP story going out. Still the middle of the night in California. About 3 a.m., Ed calls me and said, do you suppose we'd better wake up the president? It'd be a pretty good idea. Well, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas, United States Navy, that Pentagon under Cap Weinberger and those services took it very seriously. And I would hope that any existing administration would take a very strong and principled attitude about freedom of the seas. And I believe that we have the right to navigate essentially where we want within every reasonable limit, and so does every other nation. And so my own belief is, quite apart from the issue of whether we adhere to the law of the sea treaty or not, there would be no one would be advised to create any incidents over the growing tensions that are taking place in the South China Sea.
Either of you want to comment on that?
You know, I think one of the things that we are nurturing is the idea that the rule of law is important. And while there is no global code, in some areas we've reached sufficient agreement as to introduce greater stability in maritime matters, for example, as a consequence of the United Nations Commission on the Law of the Sea. The United States has not ratified it for reasons esoteric for the immediate purpose in this audience here, but I think here is an opportunity for both Track 2 and bilateral diplomacy writ large. Paradoxically, the relations between Chinese military and American military are right now probably as good as they have ever been. And so there's no hair trigger here. And yet, the problem hasn't been solved. Witness island building that has continued, American continued exercise of freedom of navigation, with the risks that are implied in that. And so what do you do? Well, on the Chinese side, friends that have focused on this issue for a long time have acknowledged in privacy, and it ought to remain that way, that, Bud, we're about to go over the cliff on this issue. That we haven't been able to engender effective bilateral diplomacy with Vietnam, Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, Japan. And all of these claims, which to us are matters of sovereignty and to them matters of law, are very much in conflict, and we are wondering, how do we get ourselves out of this box? And we need help from the United States. Well, China, I don't think, will acknowledge that publicly, but it is something where it is very much in our interest to make clear that pivoting to Asia does have meaning to it, and that for the United States to be a ready, willing, and able participant, together with Vietnam and all of the countries that have disputes we were likely get a boost soon from the tribunal that's considering the Philippine challenge. It seems likely to me that they will declare in the Philippines' favor, but that will inflame the tensions in Beijing, and I think that this issue to be resolved is an area where the United States really does have a role to play. Between now and next January, on a track 2 basis, but beyond that in a sustained way to try to help, primarily behind the scenes, with each of the claimant countries. Approaches such as joint development of the resources of these offshore islands has a role to play. That's probably not the end game approach for resolving sovereign claims of sovereignty. And yet things like that combined with assuring China's access to energy from the Middle East through other ways, hence the earlier dialogue I'm talking about here before, can help lower tensions, I believe, but this is not an easy issue at all. It's going to take years to overcome it. I think our military is very well positioned, prepared, and with nerves of steel about not backing down, but very clearly understanding in the United States Navy the stakes here.
You'll be pleased to know, Bud, that tomorrow night the National Committee commences a maritime dialogue with experts from China. So we have a group of experts arriving from China who are mostly international law experts, and we will have a group from the United States who are also international law experts. And I think it's a tough issue. Steve, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll just be brief. It's more than just an international law issue. I think that's what makes it hard. So I think we would all agree we ought to be present in the region with our military forces and our Navy. We ought to insist on freedom of navigation. We ought to exercise those rights. But I also think we don't need to call attention to it. It's one thing to move carriers to exercise right of freedom of navigation, and I'm not criticizing anything. It's another if your Secretary of Defense sort of appears and lands on one of those ships and appears in the region. And I think there's an issue of sending a signal, but lowering your public profile. And secondly, we need a set of communication measures and protocols to avoid an incident between Chinese military and naval ships and our ships in that part of the world, which results in a crisis neither country writes but neither can avoid. I'm on balance optimistic that we may be able to handle this because Xi Jinping has to balance two things. We say it's about freedom of navigation. Chinese say it's about sovereignty. It's very difficult to compromise sovereignty. Xi Jinping is a strong leader. One of the things strong leaders do is they insist on sovereignty and they insist on their territorial claims. And he's also made a lot of enemies with his anti-corruption campaign, and they can criticize him from the right if he is not tough on sovereignty. On the other hand, the legitimacy of his regime requires a growing economy. His legacy depends on his economic reform program, and he cannot have either of those if there is a rupture in his economic relations with his neighbors, with the United States, and with China. So he's got cross pressures, and I think if we're skillful in our diplomacy, we can keep him sort of tactically moving, responding to some of that domestic pressure, but also cutting back, not going too far because of the international economic pressure. And with some skilled diplomacy, being present in the region, being clear and present and assertive without being provocative, I think we can manage this through. But it's more than just a legal claim. It's going to require a pretty skilled diplomatic effort, mixing hard power, soft power, firmness, and diplomacy.
One thing I would just mention in connection with what Bud and Steve both mentioned was the positive role that the diplomacy of Ma Ying-jeou had played over the period of his presidency in Taiwan. The outreach, the communications. I can remember being in Taiwan when the first plane load of mainland Chinese tourists landed
Yeah.
there. It was an enormous feeling of goodwill, relief, reassurance, and that kind of initiative has been a contributing factor to the sort of, well, I shouldn't say the sort of, the stability that we've seen in the relationship and the reliability that one can pursue one's own interests in the framework of common goals. And the overarching framework there is the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Other nations are very concerned and want the U.S. presence there. Our traditional allies, all the way down to New Zealand and Australia. Australia has also begun to increase its own defense spending in anticipation of both Russian and increased Chinese presence in the region. Whether this is good or bad is not really the issue, but nations are recognizing interest, they're being pragmatic about it, and it's having a generally positive effect, I think, throughout the world.
You mentioned Mying Joe, and you mentioned how over this 8-year period there was this enormous progress in cross-strait relations. In the last month, that progress has stopped. There was an announcement this weekend that contact between the mainland and Taiwan on cross-strait issues because of Taiwan's failure, Taiwan's president's failure to accept the 92 consensus as a foundation for that progress has led to this termination of contact. What should the United States do?
That's the government of Tsai Ing-wen we're talking about.
That's right, the new government. In her inauguration speech, there was criticism in the mainland press that they said we gave her an incomplete on the exam. She mentioned the 92 consensus, but did not accept the 92 consensus. And now they're reporting that contact, which has led to so much progress and such a lessening of tension, has stopped and contact has ended because of this failure. Now, Steve.
Well, she and I, others are more expert than I, but I read her inaugural address. She gave a formula that effectively gave the Chinese what they were seeking if they had been willing to accept it. But they decided not to. They decided they're going to try to school her and test her. And I think what we need to do is back her up. Back her up, and I think when she shows that she's not going to be pushed around by them, I think there is an opportunity to get back and resuming that relationship. But we're going to go through a little bit of a testing period.
How do we back her up?
What
do we do?
I think by pointing out something very similar to what I have said and calling on the parties to resume contact and maintain the status quo and just let it go. Let it go. She's being tested, and I think after she passes that test, we'll have an opportunity to get it back on track. That'd be my view, but there are folks here who are a lot more expert than I.
Unfortunately, it's guys like us that get to help make the policy, so we need all of these good people.
Now, all three of you were pre-pivot to Asia. The pivot, then the rebalance, tried to refocus American strategic, diplomatic, and economic assets to Asia. Is that, if you were national security advisors at that time, is that how you would have articulated the policy? You think it's a good policy?
I wouldn't agree with the premise. Some of us were very much in the pivot. Bud and I were.
I'm talking about the announced pivot.
Pivot, yes, which began with that article that I mentioned that appeared in Foreign Affairs, which had a profound impact ultimately as the dialogue unraveled. In January, I just point out, in January of 1968, a full year before he was inaugurated, I happened to be still at the Hoover Institution at Stanford at the time, full time, and I went to New York, I saw Mr. Nixon, and he asked me to carry letters to Hong Kong, to Korea, and to Tokyo. And I met with leaders as sort of a side product of my own work in connection with the project that I was working on at Hoover. And it had, I think, a vastly reassuring effect by the time that Nixon was elected. Some of the first congratulatory messages came in from the very people, including but not limited to the grandfather of the present Prime Minister of Japan, Nobusuke Kishi. So I think the present pivot. Right,
I mean the present pivot.
Yeah, you're talking about
during the war in Vietnam, I don't think anybody would argue we needed to strategically pivot to Asia. We had 500,000 troops.
We were pivoted, yes.
We were pivoted, that's right, we were
Bud
pivoted.
served there, he knows very well.
You know, I think
But I'm talking about the Obama pivot.
The Clinton pivot.
I'll attribute it to the president.
You know, if we recall just when that happened, it came at a time where President Obama had resolutely concluded that the United States wanted to end conflicts in the Middle East, and the emphasis that had necessarily been put on our advocacy for stability there. But he did so by flagging the importance, in his view, greater importance of Asia, and that the United States would be giving due notice and support, interest, and policy focus to Asia. Well, many of us concluded, however, that it really was a ruse in the sense of being a reason for getting out of the Middle East, that we had to give greater importance to Asia, without any clear definition of what did he intend by that. Was it going to be greater emphasis in trade terms, national security, a series of bilateral changes, and so forth? It was just lacking in clarity, and also, by default, implied that you could casually get out of the Middle East. I mean, if we had faced conditions of utter peace and brotherhood in every country in the Middle East, it still, by the way, is the source of what powers the entire global economy, oil. President Roosevelt established a policy for assuring that stability of Saudi Arabia, and it has lasted for 70 years. For a good reason. The global economy depends upon it. And so the very idea that you can casually say, well, let's put greater emphasis somewhere else is an illusion.
Sounds like you're not a fan.
I'm not a fan.
Well,
Steve.
I think what should have gone follows from that. We never pivoted away, so we didn't have to pivot back. But China is emerging. And so I would have done it, move more resources to the Pacific, but don't talk about it.
Right.
And certainly don't crow about it. The Chinese will respect it more if you do it and don't talk about it. And I think that really, and the other thing I think they should have done is lead with some of the economic and then follow with the military, or do them together. But we went with the military, and there was a long gap until the economic, and in the Asia today, the economic is as important as the military. So I would have done it in a more coordinated way. Do it. Chinese will get the message. Don't talk about it, don't crow about it, and you avoid this problem about pivoting someplace suggests you're pivoting away from someplace else.
We'll get to the PPP, but let me just, because I think that relates to the economic pivot. But let me ask about the Senkaku, the Diaoyudao. Was that an issue at all when any of you were national security advisors?
Not for me.
No.
So does that suggest that the source of tension was actually the Japanese action, which then by purchasing the Senkakus, made this an issue in China-Japan issues? Or was it because China adopted a different policy at exactly that time? What's the explanation here? Steve's shaking his head.
Again, others can answer it. And my take is Japan had a problem. Some nationalists were going to buy those islands, and it was going to be a problem for China. And so Japan was trying to diffuse it, and they decided to diffuse it because rather than letting it go into the hands of some nationalists, they would take it over themselves. They blew the diplomacy. They blew the diplomacy with China. It was a new administration. They made some mistakes. And that put the issue in play. And the Chinese reacted, and the Japanese reacted. My sense, and others are more expert, is we've kind of gotten that back down in the box. The Chinese do some things in the area, the Japanese do some things in the area, people understand kind of the rules of the road, and you haven't heard a whole lot about it in the last couple of years. It's not been the East China Sea, it's all been the South China Sea. It's one of those ones that's probably just going to have to be managed, and kind of you're going to have to park the sovereignty issue and manage the problem at this point.
One of the memories that's evoked by this panel is the National Collegiate Debate topic in 1955, which read, resolved that the United States should recognize Red China and Red China should be admitted to the United Nations. 60 years of enormous progress. There's no reason to reverse any of that over issues really as small in the whole context of things that we're mentioning here as possible irritants. An irritant does not necessarily lead to a war between two great powers.
When you were National Security Advisor, I've never sat in a National Security Council meeting. When you were National Security Advisors, the President made a decision, or just happen. The President never said that Article 5 of the defense agreement we have with Japan covers the Senkakus. And President Obama, the Secretary of State did, I think maybe even the Secretary of Defense did, but the President never did. Is that a decision, or is that just kind of inertia? And was Obama then right to make that, to give no more flexibility? Assuming, a president can overrule a Secretary of State. A president, it's hard to overrule himself. How does that work in the national security apparatus? And was there a decision, or was it just inertia? Did they trade something for it? What happened?
I have no idea. It's too technical a question, but Bud can tell us.
No, I think there was no need for trying to interpret our security relationship with Japan. Ambiguity is, as Steve mentioned earlier, almost always the best course of action. And to escalate by saying that the United States is going to do something concrete under the rubric of Article 5 was opened its own can of worms. Well, what? And ambiguity would have done a better job there.
Anything on that, Steve?
I wasn't there. I don't know.
But you can imagine being there. I can't even imagine being there.
It didn't come up in our administrations because there wasn't anything that would provoke it to have come up. But it having come up and raised by our Japanese allies, I think it was tough to avoid. I think it was an issue it was hard for the administration to avoid and not say what they said. I have a lot of sympathy for them. I think they were just stuck.
You think they traded something for it? TPP concessions or others? Or is it just basically they've asked, they're our ally, we give it to them?
I doubt. And I think they wanted to send a message to the Chinese, again, to back off. And that was a tool. So I suspect there wasn't a deal. I suspect it was in the context of managing what could have been a crisis.
Critical to the pivot is TPP. It's the showpiece for the economic part of the pivot. Obviously, China is not a party to TPP. And even if it gets ratified, which I guess is now a long shot, it's not clear that they will be able to join in any near term. How should we handle this today?
What is the this?
The this being ratification of TPP, China's inclusion.
Well, in my view, TPP was a difficult problem, or a potential problem, from the day it was announced. I foresaw, from my own part, not necessarily the exclusion of China, but I would have no objection to including China if it were even included at this late date, as long as no one else objected. But rather the Congress of the United States as being the obstacle. And we were living part of the year in New Zealand at the time. I remember speaking with people in Wellington and advising them this would be a hard slog, no matter what happened. I can't even remember now how many years we've been in motion with TPP. Is it 5 or 6?
Longer than that.
Pardon?
It was started in the Bush administration, so it's been, right, about 8 years or so, 7 or 8 years in the making.
There's no, we're almost at the point where we have an agreement, but the Congress is the main obstacle here in every respect. Right. And Chinese inclusion or exclusion really doesn't matter at this moment in terms of what we need from the United States Congress.
It seemed to me that there may have been, and I was, of course, not party to the internal discussions in the administration, but China has been undertaking a number of initiatives that are very significant. The One Belt, One Road launch is an initiative intended to connect China to resources in distant locations in East Africa and Central Asia, but also to markets in Europe. And it is related to employing Chinese, yes, of course, but I think it was misinterpreted here in this country as possibly the overture of an imperial China breaking out, and an opportunity was missed. China proposed an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the United States chose not to participate, as if this would somehow be a matter of underwriting Chinese imperial ambitions, when it really wasn't. A number of our allies, the Brits, the French, others joined, and it is proving likely to be not only sound policy, but profitable for them. I think for us to welcome China's participation in TPP would be sound policy. And in short, the more trade we have between ourselves and China, the better off both of us will be. Forgive my, call it one-trick pony focused on energy here, but China right now has and always will have energy challenges. Here the United States is sitting on natural gas of unparalleled scale. It happens to be the perfect fuel for making methanol, which China has determined is the ideal fuel. Why not? Especially use that gas in West Coast plants to ship methanol to China. You would still deliver it at less than cost of gasoline in Beijing.
Yep.
I think it's unfortunate that TPP is being sold a little bit as anti-China, as don't let China set the rules. TPP makes enormous sense to the United States strategically to deal us into this region of the world where a lot of the projected economic growth is going to come. So it makes great sense in its own terms. So we ought to ratify it. But where we really need to get, and Carl is better on this than I, is we need to get to a point, keep the door open for China to join it. But where we want to get is we want to have a single trade and investment framework for all of Asia, which has high WTO compliance standards in it. That's where we need to get. And so let's ratify TPP. Let's have an ongoing dialogue with China, and Carla talks a lot about how to do that. And let's see if we can move in that direction of getting a single trade investment framework, high standards with China, India, and ultimately India in that framework to ensure greater prosperity for all of us in Asia. That's in everybody's interest.
Any chance it gets ratified?
You know, there's a lot of talk about lame duck. You know, we have to see. This election season is as unpredictable as anything any of us have ever seen. Who knows? That's right. Who knows what's possible?
No way.
Sitting in a former PACOM commander, who now happens to sit on the board of the National Committee, said that the greatest security threat in the Asia Pacific is climate change. Do you agree with that? Do you think that's the greatest threat? If you don't, what do you think the greatest threat is?
No.
You don't agree?
No.
What is the greatest threat?
The very matters we're discussing here and the prospect of conflict.
So
Trade warfare, military engagements.
North Korea.
North Korea,
Right.
exactly. He's perfect, spot on. North Korea, there are.
Well, what we've discussed here is a bit different from saying North Korea. What we've basically been discussing is China. Your answer suggested that you thought China might be the greatest security threat, or you think North Korea is the greatest. China is obviously.
An immediate security. I believe that in the short term, North Korea is our
Greatest threat.
single largest potential threat. China is not a potential threat, even on my radar screen.
Right.
And I cannot see that occurring. North Korea, yes, it's not just miscalculation. It's quite deliberate. The notion that Kim Jong-un is some sort of wacko is simply, in my view, simply wrong. It's not so. This is a dynastic, if so, he's a dynastic wacko.
But what's the greatest threat to you?
Well, I think allowing matters in the Sino-U.S. relationship to get out of control is the greatest threat and requires our complete focus. Neither country wants it, and yet it, left untended, could escalate through accidents, through incidents at sea, through collisions, through unfortunate rhetoric, and just tending, or as George Shultz used to call day-to-day diplomacy, gardening, making sure that the relationship stays on an even keel.
Steve?
I would agree with my colleagues from the Reagan administration. I think North Korea is the biggest threat. I wouldn't call China a threat at this point. I would call it a challenge and an opportunity. And I think managing that challenge and opportunity is the most pressing and challenging issue in the region. But we can do it.
There is an issue that I suppose may come out in discussion, but it is China's continued support for North Korea. And without active Chinese support, North Korea is toast. The notion that China is enforcing upon North Korea some rigid sanctions and not allowing shipping, for example, is somewhat problematic, if not mythical, in that the enforcement will be and is highly selective.
We're quickly running out of time, and we've got a great audience. I want to open the floor to the audience, but let me just ask one final question of my own, even though I've got another dozen. You have 1 minute with the new president of the United States, and you need to tell her something about U.S.-China relations. What would you say in that 1 minute? Follow Dick Nixon.
I would, I'm enamored of neither prospect, but I cannot believe that we are going to put a real estate magnate who may be the largest supporter of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please accept my apologies in advance, Carla, and every other representative of CFR. We cannot allow for one moment this notion that such a person would conduct the diplomacy of the United States. It seems to me impossible. That's my greatest fear.
But what do you tell him about U.S.-China, or her about U.S.-China relations?
1 minute with him or her, I would say to her, if that's the case, like all likelihood it would be, see if you can develop some new facets of the U.S.-China relationship to strengthen it overall, to put a larger superstructure, infrastructure on which a superstructure can be built. To him, I would say, watch out.
Bud.
Well, I think avoiding I'm trying to change the phrase that was unfortunate for characterizing the first term of President Obama's administration. Don't do stupid things.
It wasn't exactly that, but it was.
But to the contrary, nurture relations with every country in the region. Understand how badly things could go wrong. Could Japan go nuclear as a consequence of tensions rising with China over energy? Tend energy very carefully. Maintain the rule of law and freedom of navigation. Get your best diplomats on the job in every one of those capitals out there. But all these things are things that people with common sense do anyway. It's just making sure we have people with common sense. And
That's very artful.
Steve.
Well, I'm going to take a pass on this. As to Hillary Clinton, she won't be asking me for my minute. She's got a lot of very capable people that she'll listen to on China, and she knows a lot about it. And as to Donald Trump, I'd be talking to him about what kind of team he ought to put together to help him on foreign policy. I wouldn't, in the first meeting, start getting into issues. He's going to need some time to get up to speed. But I would talk to him about people, and that national security is a team sport, and I'd talk to him about the kinds of people and the kind of team he ought to be putting together to help him.
Watch what happens in Cleveland.
That's it. Let me open the floor to questions. If we could come forward with the microphones. I see some hands over here. Weidong? Yeah.
Okay. Chen Wei from China Daily. I just want to, push you on the South China Sea issue. Obviously, you are not very satisfied with the spiral of escalation and sort of Mr. Hadley, the landing on the aircraft by Secretary Carter. So do you think under President George Bush or President Reagan for you two would have more wisdom to not let the tension to escalate to what is today, or going forward to the arbitration. What do you think, both sides could do to have a sort of a face saving for both sides? Some suggest the U.S. as the biggest power should take the step first. Thank you.
I think there is a lot more continuity in American foreign policy across administrations than people give credit to, and I think that's particularly true in China. I'm not really criticizing what Ash Carter would do. I would just think that I would have had a different approach in how to do it. I don't think there's a face saver or a quick fix here. I think what we need to have is an engagement with the Chinese at every level to talk about this issue and how this issue is going to be managed. And I would do it privately. I would try to do it at a strategic level. I would do it intensively, and I would do it early on in the new administration.
Thank you very much. Jennifer Chen with Shenzhen Media Group China. We know the UK's decision to leave the European Union has serious global implication and has been the hype of media for the past 3 days. I would like to know, how do you foresee the impact and possible influence on the US and US-China relations? Thanks.
Speaking of Brexit,
Brexit, an influence on US-China relations.
is that a question directed to someone or all of us?
Any of you?
You can take it.
I would say that it has unforeseen consequences. After all, Canada and Britain were the very first to recognize the People's Republic of China. These were the first nations to grant diplomatic relations shortly after October 1st, 1949. And the attachment, whether it be emotional or simply historic, of Britain to Asia and specifically to China, and in the rupture causes ripples, I think, in the relations of other European nations with China. After all, China has highly developed policies and activities with respect to every major Western European country. And the departure of Britain having taken center stage has the most profound consequences that I don't think anyone has quite figured out yet, to adding up the total cost emotionally, politically, economically, and every other way under these circumstances. Totally unpredictable and not foreseeable in all of the implications that are going to develop. And some reverberation on China is absolutely important. I was in Hong Kong the day that the accord was signed for the return of Hong Kong sometime into the future. And I could feel the emotional impact of the detachment, if you will, from Britain that would result as a consequence of that. I think that the British stake in Asia is enormous, and these ripple effects will be felt for a long time to come.
It seems to me that there will be a profound impact on China if, as is being speculated now, other countries beyond the UK follow suit. China is focusing now intensively on developing its penetration of the European market, economy. It's really the central purpose of the One Road and this massive infrastructure building of everything from pipelines to railways to interstates and so forth to the European market. If you go to every country in Eastern Europe right now, you'll find China very much visible because of wage rates being lower in Bulgaria than they are in China, and an excellent place to center manufacturing and so forth and overseas development of the Chinese economy. Well, and so anything which holds the possibility of disrupting what have been a fairly predictable European market of enormous scale should worry China. However, the course of history could be changed if there are already a lot of signatories about another referendum, so it's beyond my calculus.
Dan.
I wish this could go on for another 5 hours, but I thank you so much for your service and your
Well done, Ben.
Enjoyed being with you, Dick.